Nancy Elizabeth Toffolini was born on May 17, 1964 in Boston, Massachusetts. Raised in Florida, Nancy would initially find work as a model, as well as finding part-time work at local wrestling shows, selling programs. A fan of the sport from a young age, Nancy would be noticed by then professional wrestler and future husband-to-be Kevin Sullivan while taking part in a photo shoot under the alias Para. After several months of asking, Nancy would finally begin working with Sullivan and his group, changing her name to Fallen Angel to fit in with the group's satanic undertones. It was while on the road during months of travelling together, Nancy and Sullivan fell in love. This would be an issue, given Nancy at this point was married to then husband Jim Dowse, her high school sweetheart. The couple would divorce, and a further 7 years later, Nancy and Kevin would tie the knot themselves. With the change in her relationship would come a shift in her career. Now performing under the name Woman, Nancy would accompany Sullivan to the ring in several well-known promotions at the time, such as Smoky Mountain Wrestling, ECW, and as well as a short run in WCW that would also see her branch out more by managing the tag team Doom. Nancy would also do similar for Too Cold Scorpio and the Sandman while in ECW. It was after the couple returned to WCW that cracks in the relationship started to show. It would later come to light that Nancy had kept records of incidents of abuse during her relationship. Sullivan would deny all accusations and offered up examples of Nancy being violent, such as one incident where Sullivan had bailed her out of jail after 3 days and failed to press charges when Nancy had stabbed him. Nancy's own sister, Sandra Toffolini, described the relationship as volatile, pointing to one fight that left Nancy with a black eye. By this point, the couple were spending a lot of time in separate homes. Sullivan would cite an 11-year age gap as one of the biggest contributing factors, although many others outside would say that Sullivan's abuse and desire to keep the fantasy of his profession alive led to the relationship's demise. It was at this time Nancy and Kevin would enter a storyline feud with Chris Benoit, a Canadian wrestler at the time becoming one of the industry's next big stars. With his time in WCW and subsequent spell in WWE having some regard him as one of the best technical wrestlers of his generation, this legendary status, however, would be stripped from record books after his heinous actions would come to light. Benoit started his own career under the tutelage of Stu Hart, owner of the Canadian promotion Stampede Wrestling and resident body torturer within its training arena, the Hart Dungeon, as well as father of WWE stars Bret and Owen Hart and stepfather of Jim Neidhart and the British Bulldog, Davey Boy Smith. Born in May 1967, Christopher Michael Benoit was raised in Alberta. It was here, while in his teens, Benoit attended his first Stampede Wrestling show, instantly finding a passion and desire to become involved. Benoit indeed would go on to make his wrestling debut for the company in November of 1985, after dedicating his formative years to hard training, forgoing any form of social life to achieve the look required to succeed professionally. After Stampede, Benoit would travel to Japan, where he worked under the name the Pegasus Kid, with two other wrestlers that would become a major part of Chris's career going forward. Eddie Guerrero and Dean Malenko would work with Benoit not only in New Japan, but ECW, WCW, and on to WWE, the industry's biggest name. At the time of the feud beginning between Benoit and Sullivan in WCW, Benoit was married to then-wife Martina, the couple sharing 2 children, baby Megan and older brother David. The marriage would ultimately fall apart, as after showing initial hesitancy, Benoit and Nancy would begin travelling with each other, even going as far as to hold hands in public at the request of Sullivan, to give the illusion that Benoit had stolen women away from him. However, in one of the best examples of life imitating art, the couple would fall in love and divorce their respective partners, Martina and Sullivan. Benoit would continue to work in WCW, and even go as far as to beat Sullivan in a retirement match, meaning Sullivan would move into a role backstage and the creative team. It was at this point Nancy retired from the sport. However, Benoit would carry on up until 2000, where he, Eddie Guerrero, Dean Malenko and friend Perry Saturn would all leave the day after competing in the pay-per-view Sold Out. What made this even stranger is the night before, Benoit had actually been given the World Championship by then head booker Sullivan. Nancy became pregnant around this time with the couple's son Daniel. With the move to WWE, the birth of the son, and the couple's marriage in November of 2000, all seemed to be perfect. Chris would go on to win the top belt in WWE the same night that best friend Eddie Guerrero also won gold. The two marked this by celebrating together in the ring after the bell. Benoit would also be joined in the ring by Nancy and son Daniel, the public persona and character masking the truth behind the couple's often rocky relationship. Fellow wrestler Michael Durham, known by his in-ring name Johnny Grunge, would often be called during the couple's arguments to act as a mediator. Durham somehow calming the situation through conversation and humour. The couple would lose this support in 2006, however, when Durham passed away at the age of 38. It would also come to light after the tragedy that Nancy had filed for divorce in 2003, as well as filing for a non-contact order in relation to her and son Daniel. Nancy would drop both only 2 months later after her and Benoit attended a court hearing holding hands stating they had resolved their issues. At the time of the filing, Nancy had requested sole custody of Daniel, citing an example of her leaving the house in fear of her safety, as well as incidents where Benoit had wrecked furniture and one incident where he had lost his temper and threatened to strike her. Losing Grunge as a support network was only made worse by the fact that Benoit had lost best friend Eddie Guerrero the year previously in 2005. It was stated by many that Guerrero was one of those who knew how to calm Benoit and could keep him from making any choices he would later regret. Although there were many issues within the Benoit marriage, one of the major factors was Chris's use of steroids. Chris had went as far as to continue to use these even when injured, fearing he may lose his physique. Indeed, texts between Nancy and Benoit were shown up until just weeks before their deaths, where Nancy would urge Benoit to stop. Quote, "Get off the crap you're on. It's making you passive aggressive and I don't need the abuse." As well as a text later that same month, quote, "Get off the stuff. I'm probably not the only one that can see it, and we both know the wellness policy is a joke." Nancy also spoke to several people about her belief Chris may have been cheating on her while on the road. She cited Benoit taking calls outside the house, as well as owning a second phone. Nancy also pointed to an atmosphere she felt while backstage at a live WWE show. Nancy told friend Pam Clark she intended to question Chris about his potential infidelity. During the conversation, Nancy also spoke to Clark about the abuse she'd suffered at the hands of Benoit, and that she had inferred she'd also kept evidence of this. However, later searches of the house and a safety deposit box led to dead ends. Nancy had spoken to the family doctor, Phil Aston, the day before her death, about raising her son Daniel herself, the belief being that she was contemplating moving back to Florida to be closer to her family. Dr. Aston's involvement would not end here, however. Aston would also treat Benoit and be the person that would supply Benoit with a long list of prescription drugs, steroids and human growth hormone. Aston met with Benoit on Friday, June 22nd, where he would prescribe him antidepressants, stating that he showed no, quote, signs of any distress or rage or anything. An odd statement given his last prescription, and also going as far as to say, quote, "I'm still very surprised and shocked, especially with his child involvement." Dr. Aston went on to state he'd prescribed testosterone to Benoit simply to help with Chris's low levels, a condition however known to affect those abusing steroids. Aston would later go on to be indicted and charged for supplying a long list of illegal drugs before passing away from a heart attack on the anniversary of the discovery of Nancy and Daniel's bodies, after being found guilty and sentenced to 10 years. Benoit had initially began taking steroids when in high school to achieve the look he felt he needed to succeed in the wrestling industry. Chris's steroid use seemed to be excessive, even going as far as to take these after the murders of his wife and son, with autopsy reports showing testosterone levels 10 times that of a normal person, indicating he had taken these shortly before he had died. Dr. Aston supplied large amounts to Benoit, with a 10-month prescription being written every 3 to 4 weeks under testosterone replacement between 2006 and 2007. After the tragedy, both investigating officers and Nancy's own family would find large quantities of several types of steroids, human growth hormones and other drugs in suitcases and wardrobes within the Benoit household. Benoit was also found to be ordering some of his drugs online illegally, using the company MedX Life, having drugs shipped from Florida. Not only would Benoit purchase more steroids, but anti-estrogen drugs used to battle side effects caused by prolonged use. Benoit would use his company to deliver drugs to him while on the road with WWE. His employers were no strangers to scandal involving steroids, however, with revelations from some of its biggest stars such as Hulk Hogan that it was commonplace. The company had tried to shift focus off those with a less natural physique. In an attempt to dissuade its employees to stop taking drugs, WWE introduced a wellness policy, a system that on the first occasion, if those who went against it and tested positive for any drugs, would be suspended for 30 days without pay. The second infringement resulted in a 60-day suspension and possible rehab treatment, with a third resulting in dismissal. The policy itself was not given credibility, with not only Nancy but fellow professionals commenting on how poor it was, and journalists going as far as to also label it a joke, stating top stars would not face the same scrutiny for fear that they would fail. Benoit, during his time of testing, would pass according to WWE, although some believe he cheated these, and indeed, given claims Benoit had never taken an extended break from taking steroids, it would seem he had found a loophole. Drugs and infidelity wouldn't be Nancy and Chris's only issues, however. Nancy had tried to convince Chris to consider retiring from wrestling and spend more time with his family. The couple had went as far as to produce merchandise for a training school, thought to be the next logical step in Chris's career. Much like his days with Stu Hart, he would look to nurture the next generation of stars. Although it's thought Chris was reluctant to give up such a lucrative job, believed to be in the region of around $1 million a year after bonuses. Indeed, Benoit had once remarked to fellow wrestler Rob Van Dam that, quote, "Some of us just don't know when to get out," after Van Dam had turned down a new contract. Nancy had also become aware of a $250,000 life insurance policy taken out by Benoit, with the benefactors of it being ex-wife Martina and his other children, Daniel and Megan. Nancy demanded that Benoit altered the policy, texting Chris, quote, "If you wanted your wife to have your retirement fund, you would have given it to her in the divorce. If you wanted her to have more, you wouldn't have tried to hide your money. Now it's at the point we are married, I come first." Benoit would refuse Nancy's request, however. Although the public image would be one of a happy family, friends would regularly witness the couple argue in public for a variety of reasons, some saying that on occasion they'd witnessed physicality between both. Both also regularly used and abused drugs and alcohol, with Nancy's own sister stating she had been witness to the couple's excessive usage multiple times. It is believed that Nancy had tried to reduce her intake a short time before her death, perhaps in an attempt at this fresh Florida start she had spoke about with her son Daniel. Empty beer cans and wine bottles were found during the search of the Benoit household, but due to decomposition, it could not be determined if the Benoits had any alcohol in their system. In the sport of wrestling, none of this would be unorthodox. The wellness policy itself was introduced shortly after the death of Benoit's friend, Eddie Guerrero, with his death believed to be caused by years of steroids and other prescription drugs. Indeed, the list of wrestlers who have lost their lives due to drugs could be an hour-long video itself. Names such as Kurt Hennig, Miss Elizabeth, Sherry Martel, the British Bulldog, Big Boss Man, and Crush all losing their lives at a young age. Wrestlers from all generations admit to regular use of not only alcohol but pain medication while on the road. The sport seeing its performers take massive impacts in several different shows weekly. With TV tapings as well as house shows, wrestlers would think nothing of swallowing pills to get them through the wear and tear caused by falling down over and over for others' entertainment. Chris, however, would be known for his more high-risk style. Taking inspiration from his idol Dynamite Kid, Benoit would perform his signature move, the diving headbutt. The style itself and moveset, as well as the lifestyle, led to Dynamite Kid, real name Thomas Billington, being confined to a wheelchair later in life, before passing away at the age of 60. This style would bring with it more risk as well as more chance of concussion, something that would be brought to light after Nancy and Daniel's murder. Not only did Benoit have physical issues due to his job, or issues performing in the bedroom due to his use of steroids, but Benoit's mental state had taken a turn for the worst in the months before he took Nancy and Daniel's lives. Chris had placed a curfew on Nancy and Daniel, asking they did not leave the house after 6 p.m. Benoit had become increasingly paranoid that someone would try to kidnap them. Benoit himself also began to take different routes home or when running errands, fearing he was being followed. Benoit spoke to friends and family stating he felt someone may be out to get them and refused to have son Daniel play outside unsupervised. Benoit went one step further, moving them into a gated community and purchasing 2 large German Shepherds to protect the home while he was on the road. Unfortunately, the danger would come while Benoit was home. On Friday the 26th of June, Chris Benoit had dropped son Daniel off at his horse riding class before attending his appointment with Dr. Aston. After the appointment, Benoit spent time taking photos and signing autographs for the people in the waiting room, where the last known photo of Benoit alive was taken. From here, Benoit spoke to fellow WWE wrestler Bob Holly and invited him over to spend some time at the Benoit household. Holly declined, stating he didn't want to intrude and felt Chris should spend his time off with his family. Holly would later ponder, however, if this tragedy could have been avoided had he accepted Chris's invitation. After this, Benoit met with Ray Rawls. The two met as Benoit had Rawls make the gear he used in ring. Rawls had been sacked by WWE in 2005 after it came to light he'd exposed himself to a minor. Benoit had initially helped him gain employment with WWE and saw no issue continuing their friendship after Rawls was charged and admitted guilt in court. During the rest of the day, Chris spoke to several other people, showing no signs of the horrors he was about to commit over that weekend. Benoit spoke to travel partner Chavo Guerrero, nephew of close friend Eddie. The two had become closer since Eddie's death, and Chavo had arranged to pick Chris up that weekend for the live events. He also called a local car dealership to discuss potentially selling one of his cars, as well as Nancy, who was food shopping at the time. Benoit also called and arranged for a pool cleaning company to attend that afternoon. When in attendance, they witnessed Chris and son Daniel barbecuing food. On the face of it, nothing would appear out of place. No sign of what would begin later that evening. Call records show a call was made from the Benoit household to request the number for the local police department at 9:25 p.m, although no attempt would be made to contact the police by anyone, and it would also come to light the number given was obsolete anyway. Some 7 minutes later, a call was made to next door neighbour Holly Schrepfer. There were further calls made to this number 1 minute later at 9:33 p.m. and once again at 10 p.m. All 3 calls, of course, went unanswered and no voicemails were left after any of them. However, it is believed these calls may have been made by Nancy looking for help. Later that evening, Benoit entered a room upstairs where Nancy would often relax and watch TV. In Nancy's sister's own words, Benoit would proceed to brutalise Nancy while killing her. Bruising to Nancy's body, as well as a bloodied head, believed to be caused by striking it off the floor while her arms were bound behind her back, vindicated this. After binding Nancy's hands and feet, Benoit would place his knee on his wife's back and using an electrical cord would choke his wife and mother of his youngest child to death. After murdering Nancy, Benoit would wrap his wife's body in a blanket and place a Bible beside it. The next morning at 8:30 am, Chris called next-door neighbour Holly Schrepfer and left a voice message. Benoit advised that son Daniel had fallen ill, and as a result, he would not be able to attend his scheduled horse riding lesson. The reality was, however, that a few hours after killing his wife, Benoit had entered 7-year-old Daniel's room and, using a chokehold, had ended his own son's life. Toxicology reports also show that Daniel had been given the adult drug Xanax, with some going to say Daniel would be more than likely unconscious at the time that Benoit carried this out, a small mercy for an innocent child in this situation. Benoit would also go on to place a Bible beside Daniel's body, as he had done with Nancy. A large knife was found in Daniel's room, but given no such weapon was used, it's not known if it was put there by Chris or perhaps a fearful Daniel. Benoit made another call later that day at 1:57 p.m. and left another voicemail with Michael Parker. Parker had been let go by WWE and Benoit called up to discuss it. The message was said to be hard to follow, with Benoit slurring his words at points and rambling throughout. At 3 p.m, next door neighbour Holly called back and spoke to Benoit for around 10 minutes. Benoit informed her that both Nancy and Daniel had fallen ill with suspected food poisoning, and that it would be isolating until they felt a little better. Holly would later go on to state that upon reflection, it seemed as though Chris was just trying to dissuade her from checking on Nancy. At 4:02 p.m, Benoit would use the family computer to search for information on the prophet Elijah from the Old Testament. In it, Elijah was able to bring a young boy back to life for an already grieving widow who had helped him when he first came to the city. Elijah, through prayer to God, was able to restore life to the boy who had passed away from illness during the time of famine. Was Benoit at this point reflecting on his actions and looking for an answer anywhere as to how to take it back, or just pure coincidence? Benoit was scheduled to perform on that evening's live event, and as a result called travel partner Chavo to say he would be unable to attend due to Nancy and Daniel both suffering from food poisoning. During the call, Benoit told Chavo he loved him, which seemed odd. After hanging up, Chavo would call Benoit back to make sure everything was okay. Benoit assured him it was all okay before Chavo reiterated Chris needed to make sure he made that weekend's pay-per-view event, Armageddon. At around 6:10 p.m. that evening, Benoit made a call to the WWE's Talent Relations office to advise them he would not be at that night's scheduled show. However, Chris would state that both Nancy and Daniel were in hospital after vomiting blood. Again, Benoit was urged by the person he spoke to make sure he attended Armageddon that next evening. It was thought this was the last time anyone spoke to Chris Benoit. On Sunday the 24th, between 3:51 and 3:58 a.m, Benoit texted Chavo, as well as WWE referee and fellow travel partner Scott Armstrong, to make them aware of the horrors that had unfolded in the home that weekend. Messages sent from both Chris and Nancy's phone read, quote, "My physical address is 130 Green Meadow Lane, Fayetteville, Georgia 30215. As well as another that read, quote, "The dogs are in the enclosed pool area, garage side door open." Sometime after sending these texts, Benoit would enter his basement gym and would set up his lap pull-down weight machine with around 240 pounds before using it to lift him off the floor, breaking his neck and hanging himself in the process. It is believed that Benoit had Google searched on methods you could use to break your own neck. During the day of Sunday the 24th, WWE tried to contact Benoit to confirm he would still be attending that night's Armageddon event. As well as inform him of the changes made to his travel, they would go as far as to contact local hospitals, as Chris's previous communications had inferred Nancy and Daniel would be receiving treatment at the time. With no success in contacting Benoit, the event went ahead, with WWE commentator Joey Styles simply stating Benoit wouldn't be in attendance that night due to a family emergency. The next day, on Monday the 25th, Chavo and referee Armstrong made WWE's Talent Relations aware of the messages they had both received from the Benoit's phones. Head of Department John Laurinaitis then requested a welfare check at the household by the local police. At 12:45 p.m, the bodies of Daniel, Nancy and Chris Benoit were discovered by the Fayetteville police. 2 hours later, the news of the deaths was relayed to WWE, although it is not known what details were shared at this time. In another meeting of life-reflecting art, WWE at the time were scheduled to hold a memorial for its owner and on-screen villain, Vince McMahon. McMahon had supposedly met his untimely end thanks to a limousine explosion, and the story would have seen the character return to reveal he'd faked his death in order to uncover a plot to overthrow him from within his own family. Somewhat eerily, this meant that the arena in Corpus Christi that evening already displayed a coffin at ringside, a wreath in the ring, and wrestlers already dressed as though they'd be attending a funeral when McMahon gathered them in the ringside to make them aware of the deaths. Wrestlers were informed they did not have to stay, as that night's TV show would be cancelled. The episode itself would serve as a tribute to Benoit, with comments from fellow wrestlers such as CM Punk, Edge, John Cena, and Stone Cold Steve Austin, as well as a musical tribute and some of Benoit's most memorable matches. Co-workers spoke of a caring friend, each star sharing stories and memories of Chris, as well as his work ethic and commitment to the business. One of those people who spoke, William Regal, was accused of knowing more than he admitted, as his words focused more on the work ethic rather than the man himself. Regal would later debunk this during his podcast with Matt Coon. In it, Regal stated his wife had been friends with Benoit's ex-wife Martina, and as a result, Benoit had not been welcome in their household. Regal further stated that when WWE had failed to contact Benoit, he had asked his wife on the Sunday, the 24th, to check on the family. Regal's wife refused, as she did not know where the family lived and did not like Benoit. Regal would check in with his family regularly during the day, as living close in the area, he had no idea if there was a killer on the loose, maybe even in his words, targeting wrestlers. Regal went on to state before recording his tribute, fellow wrestler JBL asked him, quote, "You don't think he had anything to do with it, did you?" Well-known wrestling journalist Dave Meltzer accused WWE management of keeping the reality of Benoit's actions from his co-workers, arguing they must have been aware the police were not looking for anyone else in connection with the deaths. Sometime after the killings, conspiracy theorists would place another wrestler, Dave Taylor, at the house that weekend. This was easily disproved, as Taylor was with WWE at the time, with evidence to show that fact. However, it wouldn't take that long for the Benoit's friends and family to find out what had happened over that weekend. By that evening, news reports confirmed Chris Benoit had killed his 7-year-old son Daniel and wife Nancy before killing himself. Although much was made about Chris's use of performance-enhancing drugs by the media after the killings, this could not be confirmed as a real reason or cause. The simple explanation of a moment of roid rage would be dismissed anyway, given the history of alleged abuse within the relationship. There was, however, a more legitimate cause pointed to in terms of contributing factors, although it would not seek as a reasoning and a get-out-of-jail-free card in terms of Chris and his actions. After Benoit's suicide, his brain was passed to the Concussion Legacy Foundation at the request of Dr. Chris Nowinski. Nowinski had actually performed as a wrestler for WWE previously, but due to his own issues with concussion, was forced to retire early from the sport. Nowinski's work saw him investigate long-term effects of head trauma and CTEs on professional athletes, not only wrestlers, but other contact sports, such as American football. The investigation found major damage to Benoit's brain, with potential that this could have caused early onset dementia. The damage to Benoit's brain, in experts' opinion, more than likely would have affected his personality, although again, there's no way to track where this may have begun to show signs. Another factor given as a possible catalyst was Benoit's son Daniel's health. It had been reported that Daniel suffered with Fragile X syndrome, a genetic disorder that fails to make proteins required for brain development and can affect memory, problem solving and abstract thinking. This was even commented on by WWE attorney Jerry McDevitt, who stated Daniel's condition, quote, was taking a difficult toll on Benoit and his wife Nancy. The illness itself, however, would be totally debunked by those around the family, with Daniel's own teachers stating he did not struggle and they saw no signs of any symptoms, and Nancy's sister Sandra going one step further to shoot it down after receiving Daniel's medical records when he died. Sandra Toffolini would further comment she had also been made aware that Chris was suffering from an enlarged heart at the time of the murders. Toffolini believed this would have killed Benoit, going as far as to say she thought, in her opinion, he would last less than a year. WWE would also dismiss the work done by the Concussion Legacy Foundation, releasing a statement stating, "While this is a new emerging science, the WWE is unaware of the veracity of any of these tests. Be it for Chris Benoit or Andrew Martin, Dr. Emilio claims that Mr. Benoit had a brain that resembled that of an 85-year-old with Alzheimer's, which would lead one to ponder how Mr. Benoit would have found his way to an airport, let alone being able to remember all the moves and information that is required to perform in the ring." The company would do their utmost not to involve themselves in any discussions as to possible causes, given the health and well-being of their talent would come under scrutiny during this time. They would go as far as to erase his name from the record books, as well as restrict appearances on any future DVD releases to multi-man matches only. Benoit's name would bear no results on the search function on WWE's streaming service, the WWE Network, with historical moments featuring Benoit also edited around to try and keep him out of the broadcast. The company did issue an apology for rushing to a tribute show before all the facts had come to light, but as with most corporate apologies, this for some was too little, too late. To this day, it is not clear why Chris Benoit murdered his wife and son, although many involved in the industry and close to the family would continue to speculate. Nancy's own sister Sandra would state she believed Chris had suffered a blackout and more than likely had committed suicide after becoming aware of what he had done, while journalists like Bill Apter would make outrageous claims like it may have been a professional hit. There was, however, no evidence to show anyone else had been guilty of these crimes. Fellow wrestler Sean Waltman, who performed under the names X-Pac and Six, said of Benoit, quote, "He was a pleasant guy, but always had a darkness about him, a sadness or something." Bret Hart, who had known Benoit since he began training, stated he didn't remember Chris being someone who would drink or take pills, and at the time he felt this was, quote, "played up too much." While Lex Luger, another of Dr. Phil Aston's customers, stated he felt that steroids may have played a part, saying, quote, "Obviously, they were in the home. Let's face it, there's a pretty good chance he was on them, and to discount that they didn't play a role as far as with his temperament, I'd be lying if I said that wasn't a possibility." One of the most controversial takes came from Paul Heyman. While during a live stage event with Inside the Ropes, he was continually interrupted by a crowd member who kept repeating the words, "my boy," when Heyman mentioned Benoit. Heyman snapped back, saying, quote, "You can admire his work all you want, but I'll give you my take on it, since you want to keep yelling out 'my boy.' 3 people died in that house that night. I don't care about CTE. 3 people died in that house that night, and only one person had the choice behind it, as the other 2 didn't have a choice to die. So if that's your boy, fuck you." In the years since the murders, Benoit's older son, David, that he shares with first wife Martina, had shown an interest and desire to follow in his father's footsteps and become a professional wrestler. David stated, quote, "I have his middle name, and I can legally use it if I want to." When asked if he would consider this, he went on to say, quote, "Yeah, I think it would be cool. I've got the tights with the claw." The design being a callback to Benoit's in-ring name, the Rabid Wolverine. David would go on to say he felt his dad should be inducted into the WWE Hall of Fame based off his contribution and in-ring work, although any chance of that seems extremely remote given the company's outlook and the handling of the situation so far. Perhaps more fittingly, wrestler Mick Foley, known for portraying Cactus Jack, Dude Love and Mankind, suggested Nancy instead should be inducted into the Hall of Fame. Foley was positive that it was only a matter of time, and only right, as Nancy was recognised for her work as a valet over 3 separate runs. A fitting and worthy tribute for a woman unfortunately only currently remembered for being murdered by a more famous name in a business she had loved herself from a young age. Nancy, at 43, and Daniel, aged only 7 years old, were both cremated in Florida on July 14, 2007. Nancy and Daniel's ashes were placed in starfish-shaped urns before being given to the family. Meanwhile, Chris Benoit, aged 40, was cremated after a private service in Alberta, Canada, but nothing was known as to who may have received his ashes. At the time of this recording, no one has faced any criminal charges in connection with these deaths, with the exception of Dr. Aston. Although WWE would face scrutiny at the time, like most scandals within the industry, it seemed to be yesterday's news very quickly. Nancy and Daniel's lives were cut short far too early, but has anything been learned by those who on the surface look like they could have helped prevent these murders? Only time will tell. Hello there, and you are there, and I am here, and this is the opinion piece, just a part of the video where we take the case itself, give our side or our thoughts on what happened, and maybe start a little discussion in the comments to it. You never know, because we know from some videos that people just don't agree. However, I don't think there can really be any question over guilt with this one. I think Chris Benoit is definitely guilty. I know obviously they had detractors in terms of conspiracy theorists that put Dave Taylor there, but he had the backing even of William Regal, who was standing beside him for most of the weekend as they kind of worked together behind the scenes as well. So with that, and Bill Apter obviously saying it could be a professional hit, I think that's a bit strange. Bill Apter's actually quite a good journalist as well, so I find it very strange that he came out with something so out there in terms of an explanation, when really it was one of those things where if it walks like a duck and quacks like a duck. I think Bill maybe should have looked at it that way, but you never know. I mean, opinions can change on that. Maybe he regrets that himself. The big kind of question over it, I suppose, is how responsible was Benoit, given what we know about obviously the concussions and the issues that he had there. Now, honestly, in all honesty, in my opinion, again, this is just opinion, please leave your comments down below, because I'm sure we'll agree on certain things, disagree on others, but I know obviously the CTs, we understand a lot better nowadays in terms of concussion protocols in sport, even in normal football, real football, not American football, not hand-egg. Football, we have obviously concussion subs and things now, so there's a better understanding of how that works to an extent. We really aren't. I don't think we're really scratching the surface in terms of long term. But with that, I do understand obviously that can affect personality. However, there is a big heavy caveat, a big however here. At the end of the day, the man himself had decisions to make. The people around him could probably see changes for when it started. I'm sure Nancy wasn't the only one that was aware of it. I'm sure colleagues, co-workers, bosses, medical staff that are there should have really known that there was something going on as well. And I think there's a duty of care. I'm looking into it more. I understand now that in WWE, as in most wrestling, you are considered an independent contractor. But with WWE, looking more into that as well, that's a very grey area. From what I understand, I was an independent contractor years and years ago, and I could, pick my own shifts up, do whatever I wanted. It was kind of, I said to them when I was available, and to pick up ad hoc work in between if I wanted to do something else. But with WWE, they're really stringent in the fact that they can't work for other companies. So even the idea independent contractor it's strange wording to use, because they're not. They're more employees, but if they were made employees, then they would have all the benefits that come with it, in terms of medical and health insurance and things like that. And obviously, I don't think as people who are going to get injured quite regularly, the company wants to do that, which, again, strange business practices. I'll be absolutely honest, I could do an entire playlist on suspicious things that I found within the wrestling business. Jimmy Snuka was one that stood straight out. There's a lot of similarities in Benoit's, but he was never found guilty. He was charged, but they found him to be, he wasn't able to stand trial, and he died shortly after it, I believe. But that's another one as well, someone turning up with a big bag of cash essentially, and the police looked the other way. But there's a lot. There was, off the top of my head, I remember there was Canadian gangsters, there was the Jimmy Snuka, there was one with, it was abduction of I'm getting off on tangents. Anyway, as I say, the wrestling business does seem to have some very, very dark corners, but WWE's treatment of the whole thing and the way they kind of looked at it, for me, is baffling. It speaks volumes about the amount of care that they really have for people, in terms of they were trying to shift the focus on, say, Daniel's health, which obviously was debunked, and then obviously kind of dismiss the work that was done by the Concussion Legacy Foundation, which, let's be honest, that's the more and more times went on, the more and more they're vindicated by what their findings are. Again, I don't think it gives Chris Benoit a way out with this at all. I really don't. I think he was ultimately the person that made that decision, and whether there be a personality change or not, at the end of the day, he killed Nancy, and then took the decision to kill Daniel and then himself. So again, I don't really kind of agree as well, and I don't mean it in a bad way, with Sandra Toffoli's idea of a blackout, because there's just seems to be too much thought and planning. Looking at Elijah and things like that, even the timeline, the phone calls made, the looking to kind of kick the can down the road, so to speak. I think that goes against the idea of just a blackout. But again, you never know. People, I'd say, they all have their ideas. I personally think that there was a lot of stress on the relationship as a whole between Nancy and Chris. I do think Chris was probably suffering from a lot of stress with all the grief, all the problems that he's had, his health. Not only that, but then obviously the personality issues that he may have had through any damage to his brain through concussion. I'm more than likely to think the infidelity questions and everything else has caused some form of argument, and after the fact, Chris has probably snapped. Again, that could be caused by steroids and the CTE and everything else kind of in together. But you have to look at what got you to that point, what decisions were made for you to be at that point. And again, the blame has to go on not only Chris, but the people that were there to look after him, which to me is the employers as well. Put a big focus on WWE in terms of how I think they're culpable in that sense. And as with a lot of their scandals, they seem to be able to put a statement, step back, and they're gone. So for me, yep, the spin here is on the cause. The reality is Chris Benoit was an abuser. He was, as Sean Waltman said, he had a sadness. I think he was a very angry, controlling man. and I think maybe the CTE's just made it that little bit worse, turned it up to 11, so to speak. But again, it's the loss of 2 innocent lives, and where do you go from here? One of the big questions as well, obviously, with David, looking to have Chris inducted to the Hall of Fame, is that brings up a great question in terms of, can you separate the person from the art in terms of crimes or behaviours? I think it's a very good question. I'd love to hear people's opinions on that. Take, Michael Jackson, for instance. Do we still listen to Michael Jackson's music? Can you still dance to Jackson's music with the idea there might be something darker behind it? I think the extreme case, who was it? There was a Welsh, the Lost Prophets. I wasn't a fan to begin with, don't get me wrong, but do people still listen to his music? The lead singer obviously done for, I believe, child abuse as well. So it's about separating that. Woody Harrelson. I could go on, the list could go on and on, but that is something that I'm quite interested in. How do you separate the person from the art, or do you have to just dismiss the art altogether? Personally, in the terms of Chris Benoit, I don't think it's right probably to promote him on TV and whatnot. I think that medium's probably a bit different, but it's still an interesting question. Does he deserve to be separated from that in terms of the work he's done, or is it all thrown in together? And the same with the other stars, as I say. So I don't think there's any real question marks here. I think we can all kind of agree that going forward it will be remembered and recognised that Chris Benoit was an evil killer. He suffered from problems, but all killers do. You can't really dismiss the act given because of what led to it. You can sometimes put the bits together, in terms of looking at the oily rag, so to speak, that led to the fire. But at the end of the day, it was one man, one decision, and I have to personally agree with Paul Heyman. If that's your boy, fuck you. So I'm glad, thank you for watching this one. I'm glad this opinion piece was a little bit easier to do. I don't have to go into too much different people and start fights online. So this one's been a little bit different. Thank you very much for watching it. Give us a sarky thumbs up. Leave us a little comment down below, but remember, don't be a Derek. And look out for our next video, which will be around psychology and the kind of side of innocence and guilt, looking at how your brain works and how we defend our stance on a certain subject. So hopefully you've enjoyed this. If you do think I've missed anything out, or you have any good memories of Benoit, or even wrestling in general, I remember wrestling when I was younger, stick that down below. We will be doing updates in Killing Time as well, obviously. Still got a lot of stuff happening from our previous Luke Mitchell video. That doesn't seem to be slowing down, and to be honest with you, I've got a lot to catch up on that. So yes, that will be upcoming in the next couple of days as well, probably over the weekend. Thank you very much, as I say again, for listening to this. Again, sarky thumbs up, don't be a Derek, and as we always say, enjoy the rest of your day.